Tonight's program is Ralph Harman Booth, How One Man's Vision and Efforts Shaped and Guided the Detroit Institute of Arts and its collection. It is great to be able to hold this lecture at the Grosse Pointe War Memorial. As many of you know, the residence was given to the city of Detroit in 1936 on the condition that it would be used as a satellite museum for the DIA. It remained an annex until 1948, reverted to the Elger family, who then donated it to the community in 1949 to serve as a perpetual memorial to the 3,500 Grosse Pointers who served and the 126 who died in World War II. The plaque is right outside the door. Our speaker tonight is John Booth II, a grandson of Ralph Harman Booth. Mr. Booth possesses a BA degree from Yale University and a JD degree from the University of Michigan Law School. And he received a plaque from the society, which he probably has displayed on the main entrance of his home on Lecture Drive. John? Thank you.
Yeah. Good evening. It's heartening to see so many of the great and good at Grosse Pointe here. I mean, we'll hear something about the great and good people of the past, but it's nice to see the present folks here too. This is quite an elaborate story, actually, and it's something which for a long time I resisted sort of doing research on because it's considered rather bad form in my family to brag. But, and in fact, the story of my grandfather was largely buried, I think largely by his own desire, for reasons I think I understand, because the Detroit Institute of Arts is rightly regarded as a great public institution, but what probably is less well known is that until maybe 20 or 25 years ago, there were really only two families that ran this place. One, and I say families, and understand when I talk about families, I'm talking about clans, I'm talking about extended families. The first one was the Scripps Booths, and they didn't really relinquish power until the 50s when Edgar Whitcomb stepped down. And the other one is the Hudson Fords, and I say the Hudson Fords because in my own opinion, the Fords were not really art collectors, it was the Hudsons that were art collectors. Josephine Consler, Eleanor Ford, Eleanor Clay Ford, and Robert Tannehill. They're the ones that really shaped the Ford family gifts. And we'll hear more about that as well. The story about Ralph Booth and why this is related to his newspapers is it's all intertwined. So we'll get to the story at this point. That's their house at 315 Washington Road as it exists more or less today up in the upper left-hand corner. Down below is what it looked like in 21 when it was built. Up here is a picture of Ralph Booth here with George Booth at Cranbrook. Now the Booth family, the brothers, there were 10 kids. Henry Wood Booth and his wife Clara had 10 kids. George was actually the second eldest son. The first son had a closed head injury and was not quite right most of his life. So George was sort of the elder son of the family. Ralph was down number 4, and he was 9 years younger than his brother and 7 years younger than his brother Edmund. And George was born in, I think, 1863 and died the same year that Henry Ford died. There's Ralph. That's my father, Jack. It's my mother, Mary, and her daughter, Virginia Booth Vogel, who lived in Milwaukee. Now, the story begins very young, and Ralph Booth did not work for his brother per se. He worked for James Scripps. And it was James Scripps who taught him the newspaper business. And so you know a little bit about James Scripps, just briefly. James was a bona fide newspaper man because his uncle, John Locke Scripps, not his father, his uncle, John Locke Scripps, was a lawyer in Chicago and one of the founders of the Chicago Tribune, and for more than 20 years served as the editor and publisher of the Chicago Tribune. So he had one hell of a mentor. But at the time, and Ralph started out working for Mr. Scripps about 18 years of age. But even at the age of 21, one of the newspapers that Mr. Scripps owned in Detroit was the Detroit Tribune. And there's Ralph there in the middle. There's him up close, age 21, as the editor and publisher of the Detroit Tribune. And so he got a big position right up front. And the following year, in 1895, James Scripps chose Ralph to head up a new Chicago-based group of newspaper sales for the national and regional display advertising for the Scripps papers. Now, the Scripps papers were, these were dailies, were in Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Chicago. And what ends up happening is the St. Louis and Chicago papers ended up being sold off. Detroit was later kept by the James Scripps family, and Cleveland and Cincinnati went on to be the basis of the Scripps E.W. Scripps Company and Scripps Howard Broadcasting. Ralph moved to Chicago. He's quite a young man, 22, to work for the papers, and he stays there for 12 years. In addition, Scripps was one of the people that founded the Associated Press and names Ralph Booth as one of the founding directors of the Associated Press, again in his 20s. On or about 1900, James Scripps was weary of the annual operating losses of the Chicago Journal, which had required direct management, and George Booth was actually his designated, was his son-in-law, I should say that. The Booths married into the Scripps family. George did. George owned a newspaper, a big newspaper in Grand Rapids and one in Bay City, but he was also in charge of running the Chicago Journal. And he didn't do a very good job of it, or else he was distracted, one of the two. So he was removed by James Scripps, and Ralph was put into his place. And he made a modest success of it and staunched the losses. But the problem was that William Randolph Hearst entered the market, and he undercut everybody. And so it became an even more, there were 12 dailies in Chicago. It was a terribly cutthroat newspaper market. And but it was the sort of place, if you wanted to learn the newspaper business, that's where you wanted to be, either there in New York City. So by late 1905, the Chicago Journal sold, and that ended the Scripps newspaper interests in Chicago. But Ralph's dozen years in Chicago is really where this whole thing begins, because he not only learns what it's like to run a quality newspaper in a competitive market, but he joins the Union League Club of Chicago, which becomes his really home away from the office. And the club and its members really shaped Ralph's art collecting. And a passion which he independently demonstrated at the age of 14 when he bought a Whistler etching as a birthday gift for his mother. Ralph married his wife, Mary Batterman, a Chicago girl of German heritage who was studying to be a concert pianist. She was also a very flamboyant, up-and-coming socialite who was quite a self-promoter, and managed to get herself written up in the Chicago papers for gadding about London and the social scene in London. And I think her father was a plumber supplier or something. So anyway, she goes off to Europe to study piano. Ralph pursues her. And the sale of the Chicago Journal gives Ralph some money, so he starts buying some stock of various out-of-state papers. And he buys into Saginaw, Flint, Jackson, and a small daily in Grand Rapids, oddly enough, in competition, much to his older brother's dismay, against his brother in Grand Rapids. And he was able to consolidate the papers in Saginaw, Flint, and Jackson. There were, I think, 3 papers almost in each town. The Jackson paper is the Citizen Patriot. That was 2 papers. And he did it by competition, but also by pooling of interests with the other papers, giving them stock in a combined paper. So who were his buddies? Harry Gordon Selfridge was his best friend in Chicago and his best friend in London when he went on. He was the advertising director at Marshall Field's, and he worked for this gentleman, Mr. Field at Field's department store. You may know Harry Gordon Selfridge, among other things, is really the man who was, I think, responsible for really utilizing and pushing display advertising in newspapers. And he did it to great effect for Marshall Field's in Chicago. So here's the Union League Club. It claims to be the largest private club art collection in the country. Now look at what's inside. This will look like a lot like something you've seen around here. Look, there's a picture of Washington. Does this remind you of the DAC? Okay, there it is, all these pictures. So what else did they have? Well, they had some really good things. 1897, they got a Claude Monet. 1901, the Mary McMoneys. Look at the Yosemite and the Victor Higgins. And they had a lot of Western art. So this is Ralph in 1906, and there's Mary Batterman, my grandmother, who plays a big role in this story too. But to give you an idea of what Mary Batterman was like, that's Mary Batterman there. Now this is a girl who's been a socialite in London, and she's written up in the Chicago papers. So grandfather marries her in 1906, and says, we're going on our honeymoon. She said, where's that? And he said, well, I think we'll go to the homestead in Virginia. She said, but that's for old people. I don't want to go there. I want to go to Egypt and Europe. So by golly, in 1906 for their honeymoon, they honeymooned in Egypt. And the great irony of that is that my sister Jackie was just there about 3 or 4 years ago. And they stayed at Mena, the great old hotel that was built shortly before 1906. It's right next to the pyramids in Giza. So that's where they honeymooned in 1906. So anyway, Ralph returns home in 1906 after the honeymoon. And there's opportunity knocks. The Quimby family of Detroit owned the Detroit Free Press. I don't know, is Sarah McMillan here tonight? No. No, it's all right. Probably just as well. But, because it's a story about the McMillans and the Booths and the Scripses. Mr. Scripps wanted the Free Press badly. And so you know what happened in Detroit. There were 3 newspapers. There was the Free Press, which was a basically old-school Democratic newspaper, a la Grover Cleveland, quite conservative. There was the Journal, which was a Republican-controlled paper. The publisher was William Livingston. But it was run by the Republican oligarchy that was largely headed by Alger and Macmillan. And there was the independent Scripps Evening News, which was the rabble-rouser, and attacked the Republican oligarchy at every turn. So they were anathema to the people that really controlled the town. So Scripps had a deal, and the deal was that Ralph was going to come to Detroit and be its publisher of the Free Press. And so he moves into this house, which still stands on Jefferson Avenue. This is right across from Old Christ Church on Jefferson. And that's the house that my father was born in 1907 and then christened across the street. It looks just like Old Christ Church because it was originally designed to be the vicarage by Gordon Lloyd. So anyway, they relocate to that place, which still stands. And then, the Macmillans bought the newspaper out from under Mr. Scripps at the 11th hour. Just as they were about ready to sign, they made a bigger offer and they bought it. And decided to keep it away from the Scripses. So Ralph was SOL. And the Macmillans did a very interesting thing. This is after Senator McMillan had died. This is his sons. They bought 50% of the paper, and they put E.D. Stair in as the front man. They kept the silent share. And if anybody knows, the so-called Free Press building is not the Free Press building. It's the transportation building. It's a building that was owned by the Macmillans, and it's where the Macmillan estate offices were. And they owned that paper until it was sold to Knight Ridder newspapers. And E.D. Stair was lent to them because he was the publisher of, guess what? The Detroit Journal, the Republican newspaper. So it was a Republican takeover over a Democratic newspaper is what it was. And then James Scripps dies in 1906. Now he's really SOL. His boss is gone, his job's gone, oh well. So now he's got to do something on his own. And he has this idea about, from Chicago, of what it takes to run a great newspaper. And it requires a lot of money to do that. You have to have greater profitability, and that really requires consolidation into single dailies. And so he starts to do this pooling of interest. Well, with the help of the Scripses and his brother and others, he begins to buy some interest in other papers. And he develops this idea that he wants to be the head of this combined family, Scripps Booth family, outstate newspaper chain. But the key to it all is George Booth, and George doesn't want any part of it. He's not ready to transfer control, nothing. He's still very much in charge. And after Mr. Scripps dies in 1906, William Scripps, I should tell you quickly, James Scripps had actually 6 kids, 2 of whom died very young in an influenza epidemic. And his youngest child, William E. Scripps, was maybe, I don't know how many years younger than George, maybe 25, 30 years younger than George. So he was a minor, and George was put in charge as trustee of the James Scripps Trust and really ran the Detroit News until the late 20s. And then William E. took over. So Ralph Booth collected Anders Zorn. Now these are not his paintings, but this is the sort of painting that he collected initially while he was in Chicago. He also collected Whistler etchings. These are some of his etchings. And he collected Western sculpture, just like the Chicago Union League Club. And his brother did as well. So here, oops, sorry. Here, these are his, these are George's. Borglum figures big later on in the story. These three are now at the DIA. This one's actually at the DAC. This one is at the DIA, I believe, as well. But these were given very early on. So, the consolidation's on hold. George isn't willing to do a thing. All discussions are on indefinite hold, and no decision is pending. Ralph decides, I'm going to go on sabbatical. And so he does. And remember I said his wife had studied in Europe and was of German heritage. Well, she wanted to go to Germany. He thought that was a pretty good idea. He loved to travel. He loved to mountain climb. And so they sailed in September 1911, and they went to Germany. In fact, they went to Berlin, and they stayed, they stayed in the Adelon Hotel, which is right there, in 1911. And here, nearby, is the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, which opened in 1904. It's today known as the Bode Museum. This was destroyed in World War II. But it was nearby. So Ralph has an epiphany. This is the model of a great art institution, and the model of a great visionary art director, Professor Bode. This is, to jump ahead quickly, what you're going to find out from this lecture, in my opinion, is that Valentiner really wasn't that important in the development of the collection of the DIA because he was the surrogate for this man. And there was another art dealer, Rene Gimpel, who lived here, who I think was even more important than Bode. And those two men are the reason that the DIA has the great collection it does. Now that's Bode, that's the model of the museum. The model of the museum there. That's Bode as a younger man, that's Bode as an older man. Booth returns. George has decided, for a lot of reasons, that he's tired of running the newspapers. He's got enough to do with the Detroit News. He actually gets tired of the DMA, and I'll get to that in a moment, too, the old art museum. But they decide, Ralph finally gets his wish, and they decide in 1914 to form Booth Newspapers. And here's Ralph Booth as president. George, however, has most of the stock. He's chairman of the board. And there's Edmund, the middle brother, who is the editor and publisher of the Grand Rapids Press. Now this is Clarence Booth, who is the richest of all of them. He had been president of Studebaker Motor and president of Scripps Booth, and also owned a big bank in Highland Park, and lost his money in the Depression, as a matter of fact. Edmund, George's immediately younger brother, was brought back from New York. He'd been Secretary General of the YMCA, the first YMCA director in New York. And he lost faith in the organization because he, like his grandfather, was a very principled Christian gentleman, and he hated the idea of it becoming just an athletic social event club. So he quit. And George gave him the job to run the Grand Rapids Press. So that's going fine until all of a sudden he's reporting to his younger brother. I don't think he was consulted on the subject at all. So, this is the other story. Is Albert Kahn. Albert Kahn's first commission, outside, free of masonry rights, was to build this building right here, which is the carriage house for George Booth's house on Trumbull Avenue and Grand River in Detroit. He was a very, very, very good friend of the Booths. And what happened in terms of his career was Henry Ford, because Henry Ford was so demanding and had so many requests that it consumed 120% of his time, and he simply had to drop the Booth's commission. But he not only built Cranbrook House and the Detroit News, but he built every single one of the Booth newspaper plants, every single one of them. And the other thing is this date right here, 1915. Ralph Booth comes back in 1914, and here's the DAC in 1915. Well, remember I told you about the Union League Club. That was his thing. So what did he do? He joined the DAC, but he did it in the year that they were contemplating that building. So Ralph Booth bought the collection for the DAC and worked with Albert Kahn designing the interior of the DAC. And the DAC, in my opinion, is the dry run for the DIA. This is 1950. We don't get to the DIA until 1920. Here you have these gates here. This rail is all Samuel Yellen. Here's the Samuel Yellen gate at Cranbrook House. These are all bought on sort of en suite. There's Yale, here's Caldwell, Edward F. Caldwell. There's the big chandelier in the reading room in the DAC. These are the lights in Cranbrook House, all bought en suite. Now, remember Bode. Here's the Bode's influence. Here, Albert Kahn was a great, great engineer. That's what he was. He was not a great designer. And so he looked for models. And the model was, guess what? Germany. That's the Bode Museum. Here's the DAC. Now, one of the things that's interesting is this. These were bought by my grandfather. These came from the Kaiser's Palace in Sanssouci, just outside, in Potsdam, just outside of Berlin. This is a meeting of Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great of Russia. He bought it from the Wrigley collection in Chicago. But it goes into, guess what? The Bode Gallery. Now, in 1914, he starts collecting for the DAC, but you'll also hear in a moment that when George Booth decided to found Booth Newspapers, he also decided, among other things, he was going to quit the Detroit Art Museum. He had succeeded James Scripps. One of the things that the museums did in Detroit is that they had sort of family positions. And James Scripps was the most important man in the Detroit Art Museum because he gave most of the collection. And he was the catalyst for building the new art museum, which has a connection to my family too, the old one on Jefferson Avenue. But so when George said enough, I don't want to do it anymore, guess what? Ralph stepped in. So Ralph becomes the vice president of the Detroit Museum of Art in 1914. Well, look what he bought. This is bought for the DAC. This is bought for the DMA. It's the same subject. It's Benson, and this is his either his daughter or his wife, one of the two. They're all sweet. He also had a good friend in Julius Rolshoven, and so he buys this from Rolshoven, which is the big painting in the DAC, the main dining room. That is a portrait, oddly enough, at the DIA of Mr. Rolshoven. And Mr. Rolshoven was an interesting man because he owned a big villa in Tuscany. And it was one of the places that Ralph Booth stayed when he went to Italy. Ralph Booth had a big connection with this guy, Paul Reinhardt, the Henry Reinhardt and Sons Galleries. What that gallery was, and you'll hear more about this in a minute, it was really a showroom in New York of French dealers who would send over on consignment paintings to sell to Americans on Fifth Avenue. And then he would sell them, and then he was supposed to forward the money back to Paris, although frankly he rarely did, which was a big problem. But this is the painting that Ralph Booth bought from Henry Reinhardt for the DAC. This is the painting of Lincoln that my father commissioned from the National Portrait Gallery. Now, the old art museum on Jefferson Avenue, the Romanesque building, this one. There was, as I said up here, he resigned from the executive committee, and Ralph takes his place. Interestingly, at the time, the president was Dexter Ferry Sr. And Ralph Booth succeeds Dexter Ferry as president in 1918. And more about the building itself. The building was designed by an architect, James Balfour of Hamilton, Ontario. And you might wonder, why in the hell did that happen? The answer is there was a competition in Detroit that didn't come out satisfactorily. And Mr. Scripps was in charge, and his best friend was Henry Wood Booth, my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather's brother-in-law was, of all people, Henry Langley, who was the grand old man of architecture in Toronto. And he built mainly cathedrals. And he was too busy, much like Albert Kahn. He couldn't do it. But he said, I know somebody who will do it, and it's James Balfour of Hamilton, Ontario. So this is a Scripps-Booth connection to build that building there. That's what it looked like when it was built in 1888. And it was built largely because of the Scripps donation of some, I don't know, 40 or 50 paintings that he gave to the city at the time. Now this building, and the history of this building is interesting because here it is later, and you can see it's been added on to. Well, the minute it opened, the great and good of Detroit said, aha, I want to give my collection here. Well, they ran out of space. So what happened? In 1894, there's one annex. In 1897, there's another annex. And then there's an auditorium added. And then guess what? No more land. They're landlocked. So they purchase a site from the Ferry Company. for $216,000 sometime before 1910. So Ralph Booth's first donation to the Detroit Museum of Art is this. You know, he collects etchings. So here is a Rembrandt etching that he owned. And that's significant because the estate of James Scripps donates 47 Rembrandt etchings. He was a big, big, big collector of early etchings and also print. The Scripps family were hailed from Ely in England. And they worked for the Bishop of Ely, whose library was one of the greatest in England because the three great wool markets in England were Norwich, Ely, and Lincoln. And the bishops were fabulously wealthy, and they indulged themselves with elaborate libraries, each of which had a scriptorium. Well, all of these members of his family worked in the scriptorium. So they were Edward James and so forth, and then the trade, script, apostrophe S, Scripses. They were scriptors. So James was very interested in early printing. He had a big collection of Caxton, which was the first man who printed in movable type in England, in English. And he even owned either all or part of a Gutenberg Bible, and we don't quite know where that went. But a lot of things were given to the Detroit Public Library. But Ralph donates this in honor of his mentor. Now, the city funding. This is where the story of the public-private partnership begins. The DMA was, after all, a private museum, and it was in a difficult legal position because it annually had to request funds from the city to help support it, particularly for those annexes. In addition, they owned this large parcel of land on Woodward, and I think part of it, in fact, was deeded to them by Senator Palmer, because most of the building is built on the site of what was the great Palmer estate on Woodward Avenue. The rest of it's the DM Ferry Seed Company. So what they really wanted to do, the incorporators of the DMA, they wanted to get the city to come up with $1 million to build a new building on the new site. Well, that was denied. And it was denied on legal grounds that there was no way that the city, a public institution, could give that kind of money to a private institution, period, end of story. So they appealed, and they went to Lansing, and they appealed to the Attorney General for a ruling. Well, the Attorney General agreed with the City Council, said no way. So they had to come up with a public oversight committee to oversee the DMA that would construct the new building, and that was the legal compromise that was that they came to allow the city to come up with the money, or some money, to build the museum. Now, the deal they put on the table was, we'll give you the land, which they valued at $1 million at the time. This is the DMA Incorporators. And we'll give you our art collection, which we value at $2 million. All we're asking from you guys is one. And we'll give the whole thing to you. They still said no. So until the DIA officially opened in 1827, the public art of the DMA, housed on Jefferson Avenue, continued to receive only city support considered appropriate for a private institution. That was $75,000 a year. This is the same amount that was annually appropriated up until the museum opened in 1927. From 1910 to 1919, and the passage of the new charter, monies became available. Under Ralph Booth, who was both president of the DMA and president of the City Detroit Arts Commission from 1919 on until he resigned in 1930, he decided that all of the city funds, the taxpayers' money, the $75,000, were no longer going to be used for utilities and the like. They were only going to be used for art acquisitions. And then, of course, and that left the DMA to raise all the money necessary for operations. So now the planning begins, and he had to meet with Mayor Cousins. Now, Mayor Cousins was one tough Scotsman, and he didn't like the idea of handing out money at all. And he really didn't like this idea at all. But my grandfather was able to at least convince him to consider $1 million contribution on condition that they were matching funds. But so with that in place, Ralph Booth says, I agree to be president of the Arts Commission. But oh my God. So now he has to appoint the commissioners. Let's move off this a minute. The commissioners that end up being appointed are Albert Kahn, his buddy, Dexter Ferry, his former boss at the DMA, William Gray, and Clyde Burroughs, who had been business manager of the DMA. And the Arts Commission formally accepts the assignment of raising the money and doing the collection with the land they've got. But here is the remit that Ralph Booth agreed to. It's really crazy, and it's one of the things that killed him at an early age. First, he had to sell Cousins on his vision for a museum. Then he had to he selected the arts commissioners. He had to raise private money. He had to use the art dealers to expand the scope of the DMA collection. The DMA collection was, to put it politely, some very nice paintings. It was a collection of curiosities, and it was not suitable for a grand, great, big public museum that they were going to build. He had to hire an architect. He had to start construction. He had to hire an independent art advisor. He had to acquire the works of art. He had to oversee the construction. Then he had to transfer the collection to the DMA, and then he had to open the museum. All of this, by the way, is on a timetable. And he's one man. So what does he do? He goes back to his vision. And again, Albert Kahn, who was a tremendous help, he was to be the architect until he said to Ralph, look, I think he was really thinking of Mr. Ford. He said, I'm really too busy and it's a conflict of interest, but my favorite architect is Paul Cray. You should use him. And my father, with his father, hired Paul Cray over lunch. He said in Boston, although his office was in Philadelphia, which is something I haven't quite solved, but to do it. But the interior was heavily influenced by the Bode Museum. Here is Berlin. Here is Detroit. That is Berlin. That is Detroit. Now, it's got to be fitted out. So where does he go? He goes back to the buddies that George Booth really had as part of the Arts and Crafts Society. He was a founding member of the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts, and he knew everybody. And he was a designer of ornamental wrought iron. George Booth was. So Yale was hired by Ralph Booth to do this. This was actually bought by George Booth in Washington from Edward F. Caldwell. It was supposed to be for the Frick House and Fifth Avenue, but it was rejected by Mrs. Frick because of all the little hooks and things on it. She said, women's dresses are going to get caught on it. I don't want it. So George Booth bought it, and his idea was he wanted a gallery of arts and crafts installed in the DIA. That never happened. But interestingly with this is he didn't just buy that, he also bought a pair of these, which go with it. These are the Torchères at Cranbrook House. And my one regret is that when the DIA restored this, they didn't bother to look at these, because these have the original color. This is worn. This is the original patination. So Booth's plan for collecting is to use his art dealer friends in New York, Howard Young, Paul Reinhardt, Jock Seligman, Julius Goldsmith, and to have them make direct introductions to art dealers in New York. And the key ones, as I mentioned, was this guy, Rene Gimpel, who worked with these dealers. He was the brother-in-law of Joe Devine, and a very honorable gentleman as opposed to Joe Devine, who was not. Bode, with Valentiner, but it's really these guys, Buttenweiser and Bode. And the plan is to get great anchor works to fill the collection. So who are these guys he's dealing with? Well, this is Howard Young. Now, Howard Young is a very, very interesting man. He was English, but his daughter married a guy named Frank Taylor. And he set up Frank, I think, in New York, and then they decided things weren't going. Actually, he set him up in the Bond Street. And that didn't go very well, so they moved of all places to Beverly Hills, near the Hotel Bel Air. And Francis Taylor, his daughter was, guess what? Elizabeth Taylor. That is how Elizabeth Taylor was discovered. She was the granddaughter of this great art patron who sold impressionist paintings to the great and good of Los Angeles and Hollywood. And it was in her parents' and her grandparents' art galleries that she was discovered and put into national value. This is Jacques Seligman, another great man. This is Rene Gimpel, the great This is the man that no one knows, who's so terribly, this is why, if everybody wonders, why does the Detroit Institute have such a great collection? Here's your man, right here. This man was a third-generation Jewish art dealer, originally from Strasbourg in Alsace. He hated Germans because of the Franco-Prussian War. He moved to Paris. He was not incarcerated. You see the date he died? He was not incarcerated because he was considered too important to the Nazis because of his art knowledge. But he was a mega funder of the underground, and he was later arrested and died in a concentration camp in his 80s. This is Gimpel in Paris. This was my roommate at Yale's favorite painting. It's a Fragonard now at Washington. This is one of the paintings that Gimpel owned himself. He was a great, great dealer in French art, particularly. And this man cultivated Detroiters. He would come to Detroit and he would have lunch. It's in his diaries, which I've read. He would go to the book Cadillac and have dinner with Henry Ford, Ralph and Mary Booth, George and Ellen Booth, Edgar and Anna Whitcomb, those people. And you might know that Edgar Whitcomb was a major donor to the DIA, president of president of the Arts Commission, and got the French Legion of Honor for giving French art to promoting French art in America. But here's the source. So, Ralph Booth gets a little bit of money. Or what happens? He gets Cousins to crack open the treasury a little bit. Now we're up to 2.25. He has here's Ralph Booth. That's Albert Kahn, his buddy. He's sitting right next to him. They're always sort of frickin' frack like that. This is the groundbreaking. Now, 2.5 million, to give you an idea, that was only enough for the foundation. And one of the stories is that my grandmother had her two best friends at Grosse Pointe were Mrs. Evans Sr. and Mrs. Detweiler. And probably through my grandmother, Ralph gets Brian Detweiler to agree to take on the building of the foundation with no guarantees that the money will be forthcoming for the rest of the building. But they take it on anyway. It's a great tribute to that company. So, he's got to hire an art advisor. So he goes back to his buddy, Professor Bode, whom he met in Berlin. And here's the Adelon Hotel. And at a reception, champagne reception, Professor Bode announces to the crowd, and this is a quote, "I am releasing my chief assistant, William R. Valentiner, to help Mr. Ralph Booth of Detroit to build a great museum in the United States." Now, the word release is important. It wasn't employed. It wasn't an independent contractor. And my theory, and this is a theory, is that Bode was always involved, and that Valentiner was simply the agent working his. They had in those days, there were no. Actually, the first great art historian was Professor Bode, credited as such. But up until that time, it was all about dealers, art dealers, and there were networks of dealers, syndicates really, and Bode headed a syndicate basically. And one of the things that was important to understand, particularly in 1921, is that post-World War I, paintings in America, in New York, could be sold for 4 to 5 times what they could be sold for in Paris. And that meant a huge incentive on the part of dealers, or people like Paul Reinhardt. Anybody that could bring a wealthy American who could write a check and stand by it was worth a significant commission to bring buyers to the table. And it's my theory that because of the money that's involved, unless they were just unbelievably blind, that they were offered at least 10% on every purchase paid. One of my theories as to why Valentiner, I might say there is no documentation, either in my grandfather's correspondence or really in any of the official correspondence, of the extent to which Valentiner played a significant role. And it's underscored by the fact that in his own biography, he spends very little time talking about Detroit. And I think there's a reason, and the reason is this, that during the 20s, at least until 1925, Valentiner, frankly, had bigger fish to fry. His big patron was not Ralph Booth. His big patrons were Peter Widener and John Ringling North, who were spending a multiple of what Booth was spending for himself in the DIA. And we're talking millions and millions of dollars as opposed to something under $1 million. So the money, it just wasn't there. And that's what we went around with. So this is Valentiner as a young man, hired in 1921. This is him only 3 years later. He's shaved the mustache. So Booth has to start collecting. He's under a timeline. You got a building to build. He's broken ground. My God, what are we going to put in it? So what does he buy? He buys this in 1920. He buys the Degas from whom? Jacques Seligman. He goes to Julius Bohr in Munich, from whom he buys many things. Actually, it's in Lucerne. He buys that Dutch painting. He buys this from Julius Bohr, which is a city purchase in 21. He buys this for himself, which is now in Grand Rapids. And the other story in this is that the family had a big art collection, but it was a fraction of what he bought. He buys this painting from René Gimpel. The city purchased the Renoir. He buys this one from René Gimpel, from Durell Rand, Bode. He buys this one from Howard Young, the Monet. This is a coup. This is one of the anchors. This is the great Tintoretto ceiling. Now this is fascinating because there are two pots of money. There's the money that the city did allocate money for art purchases, but the most it ever appropriated in any one year was 1927, and that was $700,000. Up until then, it was at $400,000, and it was all funds for grandfather, not for Valentiner. Valentiner had a problem. He had no credit. No dealer in Europe was going to sell a painting to William R. Valentiner on condition that it was shipped to America and bought maybe a year later or maybe not. The only way it could be bought was if Ralph Booth said, I'm buying it, and I'll see to it. And what he would do is he would loan the painting to the DI on a note, and if the Arts Commission agreed with him, he would be reimbursed. If not, he ate it. So, but there was one exception to that, and that is fixtures. Fixtures go in construction budgets. That's a fixture. This is a fixture. Another fixture. And this is a wonderful story. The story of the chapel is interesting. It was ultimately given by my grandmother, but only after she reimbursed the city for paying for reimbursing my grandfather in the first place. It was bought from a chateau, out of a chateau in Verdun that had been bombed heavily in World War I. It was all that was really left. And what was left was the structure and the stained glass up here. All of this was put in by my grandmother and bought from Henry Lee Willett in Germantown, Pennsylvania, commissioned actually. And that is the script triptych that's in the chapel now. But this sort of architectural purchases were typical of the family. The family bought extensively in architectural salvage, and that's Mr. Scripps, so I'll tell you about that in a minute. But the family bought extensively in architectural salvage. My grandfather was actually the director of a company called Roberson's Ltd., which was the largest salvage company in Knightsbridge, later sold out to Crowley's. And it almost merged with Devine to create a sort of soup to nuts decorating firm, because they also did interior designs. And so they bought extensively fragments, and they sprinkled them all over the place. They're all over Cranbrook, they're all over their houses, they're all over the DIA, they're all over churches. They just bought and bought and bought. You can see it in the Renaissance Gallery in the DIA. That's one of the Scripps pictures. This is here's Paul Reinhardt at the Collegian sale. My grandfather bought that painting for $4,500 in 1922. This is the Collegian sale. That's the great Matisse open window. This was a city of Detroit purchased from Julius Bode from Lubeck. This was the Bellini. Grandfather bought a great Bellini for the DI. This is the one he bought for himself, and I won't read it, but that's a letter from Berenson congratulating him on it. It's now in the National Gallery in Washington. I think that's it. Now, one of the things that happened, and it was probably fortuitous, is that when Henry Ford browbeat Senator Truman Newberry into resigning his senatorship from Michigan, the person that was chosen to succeed him was not Cousins, it was Ralph Booth. And he turned it down. And he turned it down really for two reasons. One that he explains, which was his commitment to finish the DIA, which was sincere. The other one was that his older brother told him, you accept it, you're out of doing newspapers and your salary's cut off. But this is what he said to Governor Grosse Pointe. yada, yada, yada. Another thing which may not be broadly understood, but to which I attach some importance, gives the service I am endeavoring to render the city of Detroit in the capacity of President of the Arts Commission. For I sincerely believe that only through the development of the finer things in our midst can we reach true greatness. And in a large measure, it is to these finer things, music, literature, and fine arts, that make a better and more contented type of citizenship. May I therefore request that you permit me to withdraw my name. Shortly after, the next person was Cousins. Now that's important because Cousins was the guy with the purse strings in Detroit. He's gone. He gets replaced by a mayor who's a former newspaper man, who's a friend of my grandfather's. And you'll see it, the funding goes from like 2.5 to 4.5 in a hurry. So he goes back, having declined his senatorship, he goes back to buying things. This is 1923. He buys the Bronzino, probably through Rene Gimpel. This is fascinating. He goes. This is the Bode influence. He goes and buys Julius Bohr. This is I don't know where that's from. It's from another clip. This is Bowler. These were bought by These were all bought by Ralph Booth, all the same year from the same dealer. This one, he sells to his brother. This goes to Cranbrook. These he keeps for himself. They're now in the National Gallery. This painting was one of the paintings that was sold by Cranbrook when they got into financial difficulties out of the Art Museum. Only the person that bought it was George Booth's daughter, Florence Beresford. And she, in turn, left it to the DIA. That's now at the DIA, thanks to Beresford. But they were all bought en suite. There's another Goldschmidt purchase here. This is Devine. Not Devine, Gimpel. This is, remember those bronzes I showed you, the Western bronzes, Borglum? This is one of the great anchors. This is a great tragedy, in my opinion. This thing sits outside by the former War Memorial downtown by Hart Plaza. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the model, the Modelo, with the Lincoln Mount Rushmore. And it was bought in the Samuel P. Cope collection in Providence, Rhode Island by my grandfather. This is typical of my grandfather's early art club. He goes and buys one. This is a lot of this, I think, comes from Seligman. He buys all of these sort of en suite, and this is how business is done. He buys the lot, okay? City of Detroit purchase, membership purchase. This is his neighbor across the street, Jim Holden on Washington Road, and then he gives these to him. So he's got a. Somebody said Ralph Booth must have been one of the most unpopular people in Detroit because he showed up in the door. You know you're going to get a big bill. So now it's 1924. They've gone up. You know, they've gone from 2.5 to 4. Now we can start building the superstructure. Hooray! So he goes back, and this is in Berlin. He buys this, and this is his greatest purchase. This almost certainly was a Bode purchase because it's in Berlin and it's Paul Buttenweiser. That's the great Van Eyck that was bought in 1925, which stood for a while until the money could be raised at Washington Road. These were bought by Devine Brothers, Bowler, and this was in the Hague. These are all paintings owned by my grandparents. They're all in the National Gallery in Washington. Now this will give you an insight. 1925, there's a big sale in Amsterdam. They're called the Castiglione sale, and Ralph wants to buy. And so he goes to Joe Devine and says, "We got to buy. Here are the authorized bids. These are the suggested bids. This is the actual plus 10% paid to Devine Brothers. Here." But this is crazy. He sends a telegram to Valentiner at the St. Louis Hotel in New York, getting his endorsement. Joe Devine assigns Mr. Folis to bid for Devine. He wants to buy them for himself. And Mr. Loengard to bid for the DI. So he's got two agents for the same business firm bidding against each other, one for himself, one for a client. But they end up buying these pictures, okay? But look here. Ralph Booth's approval from the Arts Commission to bid is conditioned on his agreement to cover all expenses and purchase price, personally with a note for repayment. And what you get with all these paintings is a note to Clyde Burroughs, and then repayment by Clyde Burroughs to Ralph Booth, if it's approved. So what happens with these pictures? Look who pays for them. Anna Scripps Whitcomb, William E. Scripps, The Clan. This is a Scripps painting. This is a Booth painting. This goes to my Aunt Virginia. She gave it to the DIA. Bought roughly the same time. Well, not the Scripps was bought earlier. This was a painting that was in my parents' collection. It was donated to the National Gallery in honor of my sister Rinky. It is probably his last painting. That is his. This is the great reprise Usam knew in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This is his daughter who died in Tahiti, and this is the chapel he was buried in, and she's sort of welcoming him into heaven. This is 1925. This was only painted in 1911. This is a typical Gimpel taste, an early radon. This is, grandfather has a heart attack. But he's still buying, nevertheless. He buys this for the museum. The Modigliani was bought in 1926, probably through Gimpel. And he was offered 3 Modiglianis, and his daughter Virginia, at age 19, is the one who made the selection. She chose the DIA, not Ralph. Thomas Agnew, he bought that, and this is Gimpel. Gimpel was a big proponent of Andre Dera. He thought it was going to be great, and this is a terribly implanted painting. For years it was in the basement. This is Dera's wife, for heaven's sakes. So very important painting. These were sort of, now remember, Ralph has got this assignment, but he's got to fill the darn museum. And he's only got 7 years to do it, and he's doing it all himself. So now, and most of those pictures, by the way, one of the things he did was he bought smaller pictures. North and Widener are buying huge masterpieces and paying a fortune. Ralph is buying things like the Van Eyck, which are more like cabinet paintings. Well, that's okay, except they don't have much in the way of wall power. And if you've got a palm court, which they did, a big empty wall, what the hell are you going to put on it? So he gets in touch with Gimpel, and there's this Quinn sale. Quinn was a big collector. He was just like, what's his name, the other great collector in Philadelphia. Anyway, he was the other great collector who sold his collection in New York. And Gimpel bought this one he paid $1,500 for. This one I think was $1,100. Nothing really. Now that I can't show you. This was a film that was made by the Detroit News photography film department in 1927. It's a movie of the opening of the art museum. It's too bad because it shows the people going in. And the featured speaker of all people is Gary Melchers, who was highlighted. Who talks about his painting The Last Supper. Well, it so happens in 1926, Ralph buys this from a dealer in Bologna. So the museum opens in 1927, October 1927. And up until then, Ralph Booth has been in charge of really everything. I mean, Valentiner becomes director, but without any real authority, until the museum opens in October 27. Then everything changes. Valentiner has a staff. He becomes everything, really. And Ralph Booth steps back. So this is the following year. Now, this man is not well. Oops. He's not well. And he's going to Europe. And this was in the Detroit News. And he's off on another buying trip for the museum. And he buys this. This is the Bellini he buys in Munich from Julius Bode. And there's extensive correspondence on this. He sweated that 2 days, battering the dealer down from 90,000 to 70. This is the most he ever paid for a single picture. It was this one, 75,000. And he was horrified that 90,000 was too much like 100, and he wanted it down. And eventually got it down. But this shows what a friend he was to the dealers. Here's Reinhardt. This is a donation in his honor, or it's purchase, it says. I guess that's right. And then this one, I think, this is Bolesky. He bought that. So anyway, so 1928, what's happened? Booth Newspapers is really finished. George Booth, once Ralph Booth took over, there was a little purchasing of newspapers, but not much. Ralph Booth had deals to buy the Kansas City Star, the New Haven Register, the Worcester Telegram in Massachusetts. George Booth wanted no part of it. He owned 40%, Ralph owned 25%, so that was that. So he's not going anywhere in the newspaper business. And Valentiner, he's now handed off to the museum. There's really nothing more to do there. He gets involved with his cousin Clarence in some real estate deals, which fortunately didn't come to fruition because the crash occurred. And so he still wants to serve, and Mary wants to go to Europe. They went to Europe every single summer of their lives, often leaving my father and sister and with his grandparents or with nurses. So Ralph accepts the position to be a minister to Denmark, an ambassador to Denmark in 1930, but he dies in June of 1931 because he had, as a little boy, he had had scarlet fever and his heart was never very good. He suffered a series of heart attacks, so he never comes back. But in his honor, Howard Young donates this painting, Paul Reinhardt donates that painting. Now here is the history just laid out for you. The DMA, a private museum with Ralph Booth president and Clyde Burroughs city manager. 1919 to 21, Ralph heads the acquisitions. Burroughs is also important to this because he's doing the job of Joe Bianco, Bill Neal, and Maurice at the DI. He's doing all three jobs. In 1921 to 24, Valentiner comes on as an advisor, but only as an advisor. He's made a director, an art director in 24 to 27, but he isn't put on the Arts Commission until when does it say? I'm not sure. Anyway, later. But it is in 27 that Valentiner really comes into his own. This is the Arts Commission. Ralph Booth, William Ray, Burroughs, and Ferry. Ferry resigns. He resigned because he didn't really like the idea of the public museum. And he wanted the private museum to continue. He didn't agree with it. And he founds the Founders Society, so he steps off. He becomes the first president of the Founders Society. Henry Stevens replaces him, and then Edson Ford replaces Stevens, but in 27, but that wasn't the first choice. Ralph Booth was a good friend of Henry Ford. He wanted Henry Ford, and Henry Ford said, no, I think you should ask my son Edsel. And that's what happened, and it was Ralph Booth who suggested to Valentiner and introduced Ralph, Edsel and Eleanor to Valentiner. It was his assignment, really, which Valentiner was only too glad to accommodate because, after all, Eleanor and Edsel were exactly the sort of people that he was used to schmoozing. I mean, if you go around with John Ringling North and Peter Widener, for God's sakes, why not Edsel and Eleanor? It was birds of a feather, is my point. And that is basically it. Questions?
Yeah, questions, please, first. Questions?
Yes.
The metal screens that you showed in the slide,
Yes.
are they anywhere akin to the one that's at Scripps' at the dining room?
Yes, they're all the same.
All the same.
They're all the same. The Scripps' and the Booths were a clan, just as the McMillans and the Newberrys were a clan, or the Hudsons and Fords were a clan, or there were a whole series of clans. I mean, that's what I call them, but that's really what they were. Or the Beards and the Walkers and the Sheldons. I mean, these families operated as units, and they often spread things amongst themselves. Yes?
I understand that there was a Scripps Booth automobile.
Yes.
How does that fit into?
Well, remember, the family were Richmond coppersmiths, and they owned a big company in Toronto called Booth and Sons Copper Works in Toronto. And my great-grandfather, Henry Wood Booth, didn't want any part of that. They were old-school Methodists, and Henry Goff Booth decided when he moved to Canada that the best thing he could do as a coppersmith was to make high-value-added machinery, and so he made stills. During the Civil War, there were purity laws passed in Canada, and so they provided all the distillery equipment to Molson's, Labatt's, Hiram Walker, whatever. They became very rich. And it was inherited by their son, George, whose son was Clarence Booth, who went into that business. Clarence had a stainless steel stamping plant in Toronto that made sanitary bath and kitchen equipment. And along came Studebaker in the automobiles. Well, if you're in the automobile business, you need a stamping plant. So they bought it out. And they made Clarence Booth president of Studebaker Motor. James Scripps Booth, my father's first cousin, the eldest son of George Booth, was an automotive designer. He built the first V8 engine in Detroit. He also built the Biauto car, and he's in the Automotive Hall of Fame. He built he had a car called the Da Vinci, which was stolen. And he won a patent lawsuit against, I think it was Auburn or Stutz, but it was after the company had gone broke, so it was a Pyrrhic victory. But James and John Batterman, my grandmother's brother, built a car called the Rocket, which is at the Henry Ford Museum. That was one of the first cars that went across the country. So when Clarence Booth, who was a name in the automobile business, decided that his young cousin was pretty smart, he and William E. bankrolled him into a company called Scripps Booth, and they made lightweight, fast cars in Detroit. And their engineer was Bill Stout, who they hired from Cleveland, Ohio. They're the people who brought Stout to Detroit, not Mr. Ford. And Scripps Booth then sold out to Chevrolet. And the interesting thing that happened, you can see it very clearly if you go to the General Motors collection. The Scripps Booth design was basically co-opted by Chevrolet and became the design for Chevrolet cars. So there was no need to have a Scripps Booth motor car company. They simply eliminated it. And then it was later folded, of course, all into General Motors. But that's what it was. And they sold out to Chevrolet in like 1918, something like that. Yeah.
Many of the paintings Mr. Booth came up with donated to the DIA, but I also see many went to the National Portrait.
Yeah, National Gallery.
Any reason?
Yes.
Was he also involved?
Yes, my grandmother disliked Edgar Richardson terribly.
Oh,
She disliked Edgar Richardson. Edgar Richardson made a terrible faux pas. He told my grandmother that French Impressionists were a fad, and the only thing that was truly important was American painting. That did it. And but you know, the family, I'm proud to say, had a lot of connections. I told you that my cousin, my aunt Virginia Vogel, Bill Vogel, who went to Harvard University, his roommate in college was Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker was the first director of the National Gallery in Washington, when it was still the Mellon Gallery. So, you know, Bill was just thrilled to go with his old roommate and said, "Would you like some paintings?" And yes. And so grandmother in the 40s, after World War II, with great fanfare, donated a number of really wonderful master paintings to the National Gallery, and the families continue to give to the National Gallery to this day. But when I say newspapers, Booth Newspapers also had an art collection that my grandfather bought. And that collection was dispersed to all the Booth newspaper towns. And Booth Newspapers was also the company that led the fundraising drive that raised the money to build the Grand Rapids Art Museum. And the family were major donors to Flint and Saginaw, my father in particular. So, and Ann Arbor has quite a lot of both Booth Newspapers and family paintings. So all the Booth newspaper towns, oddly enough, with the exception of my dear friend Jim Bridenstine, who reminds me every time I see him, he said, "God damn it, the only Booth newspaper town you didn't donate to was Kalamazoo." Where he was directing, and he was right. I don't know why, it was a wonderful paper. One of my great tragedies, the Saginaw Art Museum is not in very good shape. And my grandparents owned one hell of a Chinese Buddha. It was a very early one, and it was bought from, of all people, C.T. Liu, when he was still working for another firm, and they were liquidating it. And this is one of the, I think it's one of a pair, and the other one's at the V&A. It's a huge thing. And it was given to Saginaw, of all places. And there isn't anything like it at the DIA, and I just wish to hell they hadn't done that. But that's the way it goes. Yeah.
Sir, for those of us who have docent friends at the DIA, are you scheduled to give this lecture anytime in the future?
No, but you know, it's not unknown to the DIA. When I did all this, I made very sure that a copy was given to the DIA. And I was able to work with the lawyers from Hogman because there was a lot of confusion over what was done and not done. I mean, the paintings are all identified as to what was City of Detroit purchases. And they were, to some extent, purchased with taxpayer money. And I had an argument with Dick Manubian of all people. I told him that Detroit had a problem because I said, you know, that everybody says it's without precedent. I said, there's a direct precedent, Dick. I said, there was a great private museum, James, the Worcester Museum, Wedgwood Museum, the Wedgwood Museum in Etruria and the potteries in Midland in England. And it was founded by the Wedgwood family, and it had the best examples of Wedgwood over the 200+ year history of the firm. And it was a corporate museum. And you may know, Wedgwood was sold many times in various leveraged buyouts in the late 20th, last century, and highly leveraged, and it went into bankruptcy. Well, before one of these things, they spun the museum off, but in the bankruptcy, the pensioners didn't have enough money to be paid out. And the lawyers sued to claw back that entire collection had it sold to satisfy the pension. I said, this is on record. And it ended, it didn't go to litigation because Parliament voted enough money to buy it for the public. So I said to Dick, I said, you know, you're going to have to come up with some amount of money. It's going to be a lot of money. It's not going to be awful, but it's going to have to be a lot. You're going to have to look at the value of what the paintings are, all of them that were purchased supposedly with city funds, but realize that the monies were all commingled, that when grandfather had to raise the money, he didn't care where it came from, just as long as he raised the money. And so there's a lot of commingling of city money and private money, and some of it goes to city and some of it doesn't. And so it's a percentage of whatever these pictures were. And if you take the value of those pictures today and then take a percentage that's reasonable as to what might have been taxpayer money, that's about the amount of money that you should pay. And in my opinion, the amount that was paid was fair. I think if it had been litigated, they would have had a tough time getting that much money, and I think it was a very, very fair bargain.
Well, if there's no more questions, there's a reception in the dining room behind us here.
Yeah. Oh, I have one other thing to say. I do want to say one other thing. One of the things that I found, Rene Gimpel's my hero. I might just tell you that. He's the hero of the whole story. Because I don't think, I mean, if the museum had the first Van Gogh ever purchased by an American museum, oh, and by the way, when that was purchased, the Arts Commission turned it down. My grandfather had to filibuster them to agree to buy that painting. Now, you say, what? Well, $4,500 was a lot of money. It's a little picture. And they couldn't see it for dust. And he badgered and badgered and badgered and badgered them to do it until finally they agreed. But it would never have happened without Rene Gimpel, and the Matisse would never have happened without Rene Gimpel. Rene Gimpel thought Valentiner had no eye at all. He disliked the man intensely. And he would point out the fact that Valentiner was obsessed with getting great paintings, meaning a Raphael, a Da Vinci, and so forth. Well, he bought several Raphaels, none of which proved to be Raphaels. He bought a Da Vinci, none of which was not a Da Vinci. And the museum paid quite a bit of money for these pictures. So that was a problem, and he thought he just really didn't have an eye. Gimpel, on the other hand, was I think, a genius. And that's why it's so